Hi, let's talk about frog calls of the frogs that are found in northern Illinois. Frogs are amphibians, and they lack tails except in the larval stage, and that's in fact what their scientific name means. Their scientific name is Anura, and that means tailless. They have to lay their eggs in wet environments because the eggs don't have shells, which helps to prevent drying out in bird eggs, for example, in reptile eggs. So frog eggs don't have a shell, they just have a jelly coating on the outside. So they have to be laid in. Most frogs lay their eggs in water, although some just lay their eggs in very wet environments where they won't dry out. Frogs are the only noisy amphibians. Salamanders and the other more rare amphibians, caecilians, don't make any sounds. And this makes it a little bit easier to determine which populations are present in a particular area is by listening to the males call. Only the males make noise, and they call to attract females during mating season and also to tell competing males that they are big and strong and don't fight me for my spot. Because typically for frogs, the males will find a good spot for the females to lay their eggs, and then they will call. But only at certain times of the year, only during mating season, which in northern Illinois is in the spring. From March until July is when we can hear frog calls in northern Illinois. Frog monitoring is of interest because frogs are declining worldwide, and habitat destruction is the major reason for that. Frogs live around wetlands, and the destruction of wetlands worldwide has had a very severe effect on them. Some of them are exploited for the pet trade, which has also put them in jeopardy in certain areas, and a new threat is the chytrid fungus. Chytrid fungus appeared about 30 years ago. We don't know where it originated at this time. Somewhere in the world there was chytrid fungus for a long time probably, and then it spread around the world like an invasive species, probably with the help of people accidentally carrying it along on their shoes, and that's still how it has been transmitted into remote wild areas today, is by people accidentally tracking it in on their clothes or on their shoes. It's a microscopic fungus, and most frog species appear to be vulnerable to it. It infects their skin. They have very wet skin. It infects their skin and kills them. And some of the species in the US that are declining, one is the cricket frog. This is one that used to be very common in the Chicago area and has now been almost completely extirpated from northern Illinois. Although it's not endangered, it's still extremely abundant in certain areas in southern Illinois and elsewhere in the Midwest. One species, though, that is endangered is the Oregon red-legged frog. Now, this frog species lives at high altitude in very pristine areas, and it disappeared mysteriously from very pristine areas that didn't have the problem of habitat destruction, and it turned out that it's from the chytrid fungus. Although, due to natural selection, a very small portion of the population was naturally resistant to the fungus, and the red-legged frog is actually making a little bit of a comeback in certain areas because of that. Frogs are declining everywhere, and a number of very interesting frog species have gone extinct in the last 20 years. These are two of them that have gone extinct. In Australia, it was two very unusual species of frog were discovered. The gastric brooding frogs, the males would ingest the fertilized eggs and allow the little froglets to completely metamorphose in their stomachs, and then the little frogs would come out, and very shortly after the species was discovered and described, they were killed by chytrid fungus, which is very sad. It's probably sadly the scientists themselves who were studying these frogs who brought the fungus into the area that ended up ultimately causing their extinction. This is one where we actually have a lot of fresh specimens, freshly preserved specimens of this extinct species, and there is a scientist who's working on bringing them back from extinction using methods that we have available to us today. This is another one. This one is from Costa Rica. This one went extinct again from a remote area. Habitat destruction was not the problem. The golden toad, the males were this really pretty golden color, and they existed by the tens of thousands in the cloud forest in Costa Rica. And again, it's the chytrid fungus that did them in. Over a period of just a few years, their numbers declined precipitously, and then they went extinct in a very short amount of time. They're still hoping, because both of these, the gastric brooding frog extinction and the golden toad extinction, were fairly recent. There's still hope that they might find individuals of these species that maybe they're not quite extinct, but members of these species haven't been seen now for years. There's a worldwide effort by volunteers to monitor frog populations because there simply aren't enough scientists to do this job. There are populations of frogs everywhere, and so there's a worldwide network of volunteers along with scientists and naturalists and individuals who work in these natural areas to monitor frog populations and report it to one central location. And we have some local partners here. The Chicago Wilderness Society is a local partner. Also, Partners in Reptile Conservation is another U.S. group. And the Nature Conservancy is also funding this effort. So why do we care about frogs? Most people don't see frogs in their day-to-day life. What good do they do? Well, they're an indicator of the health of an ecosystem. Because frogs have wet, porous skin, they are often the first ones to suffer when there's pollution or degradation of an ecosystem. They're a very important food source for wading birds like herons and egrets, and also turtles eat them. I've actually seen a turtle eating a frog here. Tadpoles also, their larvae in the water, are also a really important predator of all sorts of insects, including mosquito larvae. So having lots of tadpoles in the local water is very good for keeping mosquito numbers down. Adult frogs as well also eat. An adult frog can eat hundreds of insects a day, and they also eat adult mosquitoes. So the frog calls are the best way to track which species of frogs are present and their relative abundance, because frogs, almost all frogs, except for poisonous frogs, are very well camouflaged and extremely hard to find. Many of them are active only nocturnally, and really breeding season, when the males are calling, is the only time of year that it's fairly easy to find them. And for some of them, it's also difficult to distinguish one species from another, except by their calls. That's the best way to distinguish. In fact, leopard frogs in the US were originally thought to be a single species because they look so much alike. But because the males' calls are all different, scientists were able to determine, well, it was one scientist who figured out that there was actually 5 different species of leopard frogs in the United States because the males' calls were all very different. And because the frogs don't have a diaphragm, the way that the males generate enough force to expel air and make a loud sound, some frog calls are extremely loud, is by expanding various pouches of skin and then forcing that air out. Some of them it's a throat pouch, some of them it's 2 pouches on the side, but they have to do something a little bit different than what a mammal or a bird would do to make a loud noise because they don't have a diaphragm muscle to help force air out of their lungs. The best time to listen around here is on warm, humid days in the spring. So if we have an exceptionally warm day in April or May, when thunderstorms are coming, it's very humid and not very windy, that's a good day. And in fact, although they usually, sunset is when their most intense calling is. If it's a really warm, humid day when thunderstorms are approaching or it's cloudy, many species will start to call during the day, like in the afternoon. they'll start to call. And you probably have a body of water near where you live, a pond or something, that has frogs in it, and you may have even heard them and thought they were insects of some kind, because many of them, as you'll hear, have an insect-like sounding call. So we're going to learn the calls of the 11 most common frogs in Illinois, and we're going to learn what frog monitors do to estimate population size, which is a simple 1, 2, 3 system, and I'm going to show them to you in the same order that they appear. So this is one of the ways that they make sure species are not competing with each other, is by having different calls and also not calling at exactly the same time. They also inhabit different types of water. Some of them live in permanent bodies of water because their tadpoles take a really long time to mature, like green frogs and bullfrogs, and others can lay their eggs in any old puddle that's going to evaporate in a few weeks. The first frog to start calling in northern Illinois is the wood frog, and wood frogs will start to call as soon as the ice starts to melt on ponds. They do exist only in forested areas. They will lay their eggs both in permanent ponds and what we call vernal pools. Vernal means spring, so a vernal pool is a temporary puddle that's going to evaporate by the end of the summer. Now, some frog species prefer vernal pools and seek out vernal pools to lay their eggs. And you might think what advantage there might be to a frog species to purposely not lay their eggs in permanent bodies of water. There's something missing in vernal pools, and that is predators. Vernal pools cannot have fish because if they're going to evaporate by the end of the summer. So some frog species that have very rapidly developing tadpoles will deliberately choose vernal pools. Now, wood frogs aren't that picky. They vastly prefer forested areas. They are very vulnerable to habitat destruction. And they are found in the Chicago area only in areas that have been forested for a long period of time, such as forest preserves. So let's hear what the wood frog sounds like. Now, if you hear these frogs calling, usually they're the only frog calling because they're so early, and they will only call for a very short amount of time, usually less than a week. People say that their call sounds like a finger rubbing on a balloon. This is one that you very likely heard before. It's extremely common in the Chicago area, and that's the western chorus frog. They're very small. They're tree frogs. And you can see they have nice stripes on their back. They have 3 stripes. In fact, that's the basis of their scientific name, Psuedacris triseriata. Psuedacris, acris is cricket, and pseudo is fake. So their scientific name means the fake cricket sound with 3 stripes. Triseriata means 3 stripes. And they're very abundant. They'll start calling in late March if it's really warm, and they'll call all through April and in May. They prefer vernal pools. And most of the rest of the year, though, you won't see them. And very often, if you're driving at night in April, let's say, and it's a nice warm night, if you have your windows rolled down, you'll hear them calling from the drainage ditch next to the road. I've heard them calling from construction sites that just have a few puddles here and there. But their call sounds like someone rubbing the teeth of a plastic comb. And the way that you know for sure that you're hearing a frog call is we do have crickets in the Chicago area that call. They are not calling in April and early May. They don't start calling until June. So we don't have any noisy insects in April and May here in Illinois, in northern Illinois anyway. So if you hear this sound in April, then it's for sure it's a frog. And these are even found in ponds on campus. So if you're walking around on campus in the evening in April, you will very, very likely be able to hear these frogs. My favorite is the spring peeper, and they're called spring peeper because of the peeping sound that they make. They're also a very small tree frog. You're very unlikely to see them during any other time other than when they're calling. They disappear into the tall grass and trees during the summer, and they hibernate in the winter. So the best time to find them and know that they're around is when you hear them calling in the spring. And their genus name as well, Psuedacris, so we know that they're related to the western chorus frog because they're in the same genus. And the species epithet crucifer because they have kind of an X on their back. And their colors on all these frogs, the colors aren't really exact from the photos that I'm showing you. They can vary in color quite a bit, but there are specific things that you can identify a species with. The exact color is not one of them. Color will vary over a spectrum within a species. So for the spring peeper, they could vary from greenish to brownish, but they will have this kind of X-shaped marking on their back for the spring peeper. They call a little bit later. They will call at the end of March if it's really warm. They do like ponds that have been around for a while and that are surrounded by trees. So habitat destruction does have a big effect on them. They are not endangered, but they have been extirpated from a lot of the Chicago area because of housing construction. But where they are found, they are quite abundant, and they only call for about a month. If you happen to live near a pond that has peepers, they are really loud, but not for that long. So let's hear what they sound like. So when you hear a few of them, you can clearly hear the peep, peep, peep sound. When there's a lot of them chorusing together, people say it sounds like distant sleigh bells. You know, if you hear it in the distance, you're like, what is that sound? And people, again, often mistake this call for insect calls. But if you're hearing it in April or early May, there is no way it's an insect. We don't have any noisy insects at that time of year. The northern leopard frog used to be much more common than it is. It's been commonly used for school dissections and for scientific experiments because they were very easy to breed in captivity. And this is one that initially it was thought that there was a single species of leopard frog all over the United States, and we now know that there are 5 different species, and I'll show you a second one, the pickerel frog, that was originally thought to be the same species as the northern leopard frog. And again, like the other ones, their exact color isn't that consistent. They're usually kind of greenish to yellowish with these irregular spots, but not always. They can be kind of brownish. They vary quite a bit. So here's a picture of one that's a little less green and a little bit more brown. They're fairly large, and these ones tend to stay in the water all summer. So if these are around in a pond near you, they're going to be the ones that they could be on the edge of the pond, hopping into the water when somebody comes around. So they like permanent bodies of water. Their tadpoles are fairly slow to develop, and so they won't lay their eggs in vernal pools. They like permanent ponds. Their call is kind of quiet, unlike some of the other ones that are really loud. They're a little bit quiet. Their call sounds like some clicking, and then people call it a chuckle. So clicks and then a chuckle. You can hear peepers in the background really faintly too. This is another one this is the frog you've most likely seen, is the American toad. They are out hopping around all summer. Probably if you grew up in the Chicago area, you saw some of these hopping around in your yard when you were a kid. These are our only poisonous frog that we have, and they're not that poisonous either. They have these reddish swellings behind their eyes. Those are actually poison glands, and just picking up the toad and handling it like kids do isn't enough to make the poison come out of these glands. But if your dog or cat grabs a toad and picks it up and bites it, they will squirt out this white liquid into the dog's mouth that it's very unpleasant experience for the dog or the cat. And so if your dog or your outdoor cat ever comes to the back door foaming and frothing at the mouth and acting like they might throw up, they may have bit a toad. And usually they learn, once they've bitten one toad, they're not going to bite another toad, because it tastes really, really bad and causes them to salivate, but they won't die. But that's why you see toads out in the open all the time, because they are protected from predation by the fact that they have these poison glands. So they're not afraid to be out and visible and active during the day. If it's not too hot and sunny, they'll be out hopping around during the day. They're one of our larger frogs. They are, oh, and by the way, frogs and toads, toad is just a descriptive word. All toads are frogs. They're all frogs. We just tend to call frogs that are lumpy or ugly or weird looking, we tend to call them toads. So it's not a category. Toad is not a category. It's just a descriptive word for a frog that's lumpy or weird looking. They have a call that's very loud and easy to hear. And again, when people hear this call, they tend to think it's an insect of some kind. They call a little bit later. They won't start until April, but they'll call all through May. These are one that if the conditions are right, if it's a very warm, cloudy, like rainy day, they will start to call during the day. They won't wait until sunset. They have their call is a long trill. So once you recognize it, you'll hear it all the time in the spring if you're outside. Because they're very common all over the Chicago area, and they will lay their eggs in any body of water. They will lay their eggs in a dog water bowl that's outside, in a puddle. I have seen mature toad tadpoles in tire tracks on dirt roads that are filled with water. So they're not very picky at all where they lay their eggs. So let's hear what they sound like. So it's a long, high-pitched trill. And again, there's peepers in the background. The pickerel frog is one that naturalists are very interested in tracking in the Chicago area. it has suffered very much from habitat destruction, but is making a comeback in some areas. Pickerel frogs need very clean water in order to survive and for their tadpoles to survive. So the big construction boom in the Chicago area pretty much wiped them out in this area. And these are, this species is not endangered, but it's threatened all over its range. So it's because it's very sensitive to disturbance, it has been declining in population. And you can see that it looks very much like a leopard frog. Now, the fact that this particular one in this picture is kind of brownish, that is not an indication, again, of how to identify this species. The way to identify that it's a pickerel frog and not a leopard frog is that the spots on the back tend to line up. And the spots also tend to be more square than the leopard frog. So you can see why the early scientists who were identifying American frog species and naming them thought that this was the same species, a leopard frog. Their call, though, is very different. They call around the same time as the leopard frog, and again, their call is quiet, but it's very distinct, indicating that they are a separate species. This picture here, you can see a little bit better how the spots are kind of square, and that they kind of line up. They vastly prefer streams in forested areas, so that kind of habitat has really suffered in the last 100 years. So that's one of the reasons for their decline. Their call sounds like a snore or a meow. So if you think you hear this frog, because frog monitors in the Chicago area are very, very interested in identifying new areas where they may have expanded to. If you think you hear this in a frog pond near you, send me an email and let me know, because that would be important information to people in whatever county that's in, the frog monitors there. Okay, so let's hear what their call sounds like. So you can hear how that's very different from the leopard frog, which was the clicks and then a chuckle. So even though they look very much alike, one of the ways we know that they're distinct species is by the different calls of the males. And now DNA has also confirmed that these 5 species are different species. There are 2 closely related gray tree frog species in the Chicago area, the eastern gray tree frog and the Cope's gray tree frog. And interestingly, this is a case of speciation by chromosome doubling. So the eastern gray tree frog has 4 copies of every chromosome, and the Cope's gray tree frog only has a normal 2 copies of each chromosome. So there was a chromosome duplication at some point in the not too distant past that caused the formation of a new species. And this happens pretty rarely with vertebrates, but it does happen much more often with plants, that we get speciation by chromosome doubling. So their calls are very similar, and they look very similar. It's very difficult to tell these 2 species apart. They're fairly large tree frogs, and they're also very pretty, and this is the only frog in the Chicago area that's really threatened by the pet industry. And in fact, it's illegal to collect these frogs from public lands. So if you're in a forest preserve and you see one of these frogs, it's considered poaching to remove one of these frogs from public lands. They're very difficult to breed in captivity, so if you see these in a pet store, there's a very good chance that these were poached from somewhere illegally. But they're very cute, as you can see. You can see why people like to have these as pets. So their calls are very similar. The Cope's gray tree frog and the eastern gray tree frog, because they're a recently diverged pair of species, that's why their calls are so similar. They'll probably continue to diverge as the species evolve. Sometimes, well, DNA is really the only way to be sure which species you have with these two. So the Cope's gray tends to be a little higher pitched, a little faster trill, and the Eastern gray tends to be a little lower pitched, a little slower trill. So let's hear these two calls. They're very common. They are found in the Chicago area. They're much more common in southern Illinois, though. Short trill. So let's hear the Eastern gray. This one is a long trill. You can hear some other frogs in the background there. It's a little lower pitched trill. Still a short trill, but a lower pitched trill. Again, some other frogs in the background there. In fact, there's a frog in the background there that doesn't exist in northern Illinois, only in southern Illinois. The green frog is really common. In fact, these are also very visible around ponds on campus. They are quite large. They stay in the ponds all year. And again, their color varies a bit. So they can be brownish to olive green to kind of yellowish in parts. Sometimes they even have some stripes on their legs. So like this one here. They call a little bit later. They won't start calling until we have some really nice warm days in May. They'll call all the way through June, and their call sounds like a loose banjo string. This is what the best description of it. And they hang around ponds all summer. If there's a pond where there's a lot of green frogs, they'll be hanging all along the shoreline. They'll be in the water with their little eyes sticking up. And their tadpoles take a very long time to fully metamorphose, which is why they're only found in permanent water. So no vernal pools for the green frog. Let's hear what their call sounds like. And you can see on this photo here, the males, this is a male, the males have a much larger tympanic membrane. This is the eardrum. It's right on the surface. They don't have an outer ear. And the males have a larger tympanic membrane and better hearing than the females, which confused scientists at first, because if they're making the calls to attract females, why do the females not have the best hearing? Well, the reason is because males use the sound to judge who they can fight for their spot. So the males find a good spot where they think a female might want to lay her eggs, and they defend that spot while they call. And the second reason for the call is to tell other males, I'm too big, you can't fight me. And in fact, in laboratory experiments, they've shown that if they artificially take the calls and make them a little bit higher pitched, which would indicate a smaller male, the captive males will try to attack the speaker. And if they artificially make the sound lower pitched, which would indicate a larger male, then the captive males just sit there and listen to it, and they don't try to attack. So that's why the males have such good hearing, is because they're actually using it to decide who they can fight. This species, Blanchard's cricket frog, is still really common. They are not endangered or threatened. They're super common in southern Illinois, but they've been almost completely extirpated from northern Illinois. They used to be really common in northern Illinois, but they're very, very sensitive to habitat disturbance. And you'll notice even in their name here, the genus Acris. Acris means cricket in Latin. So they sound like a cricket. And I'll tell you how to make sure that whether what you're hearing is a cricket or a cricket frog. Because although they do sound very crickety, there's some differences. So we think the reason that cricket frogs were completely extirpated and why they were so sensitive to habitat destruction is that in the Chicago area, when there was the big construction boom that started after World War II, when most of the suburbs and housing kind of went crazy in the Chicago area, because cricket frogs only reproduce once in their life, and that's unusual for frogs that are in the U.S. Most frogs that we have live for several years. They hibernate during the winter by burying themselves in the bottom of a pond or at the edge of a pond. And they can reproduce several years. The cricket frog just has one shot. So if the summer that it's their summer to reproduce, if that pond is full of runoff from a construction site and is murky and none of the eggs hatch that year, then the frogs are gone from that pond because there's no way the adults don't survive a second winter. So they are tadpoles one summer, they metamorphose into frogs by the end of the summer, and then they hibernate over the winter. They come out in the spring and reproduce once. So they are making a comeback though, now that the construction boom is over, because they do travel over land during the summer. And they can travel, several miles from where they were from the pond where they were hatched. So they call a little bit later. They call in May and June. And so it overlaps a little bit with when you hear actual crickets calling, but usually we don't hear real crickets calling until the end of June in northern Illinois. They're another small tree frog, like the other ones. Their call sounds like a handful of marbles. And the way that you can tell that it's not a cricket is that it changes tempo. So listen for that. The call speeds up and slows down. Speeds up, slows down. Crickets don't change tempo. When crickets are calling, the tempo depends on the air temperature. So if it's warm, they call a little faster. If it's cold, they call a little slower, but it doesn't change. With a cricket frog, each call speeds up and slows down. So you hear it sound very crickety. Oop. It's harder to hear the speeding up and slowing down when there's a large number of them all calling at the same time. And lastly is the bullfrog. This is our largest species of frog. They also call the latest in the summer. Last summer I heard bullfrogs until the end of July. Sometimes green frogs will call into the end of July too. They also have the largest tadpoles, and their tadpoles take a whole year to metamorphose. So if you see huge green tadpoles, especially in the spring, those are bullfrog tadpoles from the previous summer. They overwinter as tadpoles their first year, and then they metamorphose in the spring. They are the largest frog everywhere in Illinois. They are found, though, coast to coast. There are subspecies of bullfrogs that live on the other side of the Rocky Mountains on the west coast. They only inhabit permanent bodies of water because their tadpoles have to overwinter as a tadpole. So they couldn't possibly reproduce in a pond that's going to, a temporary body of water that's going to dry up. They are carnivorous. The tadpoles and the adults are carnivorous. Well, you know, all the frogs that I showed you eat insects. The larger ones, though, will not just eat insects, but they will eat other frogs, tadpoles, small birds, mice, anything that they can get in their mouth, they will eat it. So that's why the Illinois Department of Natural Resources asks people to please not move bullfrogs around. People like the sound of bullfrogs, and if they have a pond by their house, they'll think, oh, let's put some bullfrogs in there because we like to hear them. Well, if you do that, it may mean that another species of frog or a species of salamander is going to be eliminated from that pond because of the bullfrogs, because they eat everything. So let's hear what they sound like. So people say their call sounds like a string bass. It's definitely the lowest pitched frog call, and they're trying to be low pitched. So just like the green frogs, the bullfrogs judge the size of the other males based on the pitch of their call. So the lower pitched, the larger the male, and so they're trying to be as low pitched as possible so that the other males won't fight them. And you notice how one male calling triggers the other ones to also call? That's characteristic of a lot of frog species, that it'll be very quiet and then one male calling will trigger a whole bunch of other ones to call as well. So these are the last ones to start calling, and they keep calling the longest. But they're definitely not calling in the fall. And sometimes you see in movies, if they want to let you know in the movie with a sound effect that this is a swamp or something, they'll throw in some frog calls. If it's the fall or the winter, there would never be frogs calling. Not in North America. There are in tropical areas where the frogs call all year round. But around here, you'll only hear frog calls from March until the end of July. Any other month of the year, if you hear something that you think is a frog call, it's not. It's an insect or something else. It's not a frog call. Okay, so let's practice identifying some frog calls. Sounds like a loose banjo string. That is a green frog. If you said green frog, you were right. All right, how about this one? It's a long trill. If you said the toad, American toad, you are correct. That's the long trill. And with toads as well, you can kind of tell males and females based on the size. So if you find a little one, it's probably a male, unless it's a juvenile. But if it's a very, very large toad, it's a female. Handful of marbles. Hear a bullfrog in the background there. That is the cricket frog. And this is a juvenile one. It's very small. They get bigger than that. All right. That is the bullfrog. And this is a picture of a West Coast bullfrog. They look a little bit different. Same species though. That is the peeper, the spring peeper. And again, this is a newly metamorphosed one. They get bigger than that. Short trill. That's the gray tree frog. You can see this picture. You can see how pretty their coloration. And their coloration varies quite a bit from grayish, which is where they get their name, to light green to like Kelly green. So they're very pretty. You can see why people would be wanting them as pets. All right. Clicks, and then a chuckle. That is the northern leopard frog. So one more thing that naturalists do when they're trying to figure out which frogs and how many are present is because we can't actually count the number of frogs that are calling. So they just identify a calling level of 1, 2, or 3. 1 would be just one individual frog is calling. There could be more than one calling, but the calls don't overlap. So level 1 means you only hear one frog calling at a time. Level 2 means there's more than one frog and they're overlapping, but you can still kind of hear individual frogs. And then level 3 is a constant overlapping chorus where you can't hear individual frogs. So, and it could vary. One population could vary depending on the night. If you happen to be there and listen when it's kind of a cooler or windier night, it might be calling level 1 or 2. And then you go the next day when there's a thunderstorm approaching and it's very warm and humid, and it might be a calling level 3. So the calling level itself on a one-time basis doesn't necessarily tell you everything you need to know about the population in that particular area. So when individuals who are part of the frog call monitoring project, they report which species call they hear, and then a calling level and the date. So here's a level 1. You just hear one call at a time. Level 2, on this particular recording, there are a few other species in the recording, but for the gray tree frog, it's a level 2, which means there's multiple overlapping calls, but we can still distinguish individuals. There's a green frog in the background, and there's a toad. All right, here's Peeper's level 2. They're overlapping, but we can still tell individuals. Okay, level 3. So level 3 is a constant overlapping chorus, which for cricket frogs would make it impossible to hear that speeding up and slowing down. You have to get closer and hear individuals again before you could tell for sure that they were cricket frogs. So we often also hear as we already heard on some of these recordings, multiple species calling at the same time. And the frog monitors need to sometimes listen for a while and figure out all the species that they are hearing. So on this recording, there's actually 4 species. One of them is not one of the ones that we went over. There's another species in northern Illinois that's only found in Kankakee County. It likes sandy riverbanks. So, but you'll hear that one too. See if you can hear the weird one that we haven't heard yet. People who have an ear for music often have a much easier time with this task. If you're used to picking out the sounds of different instruments, this uses the same part of your brain, picking out the different species and what they sound and distinguishing them from the others. So let's hear it. Listen again for a few seconds. So the gray tree frog was one that was easy to hear on there. The cricket frog as well was pretty continuous, and occasionally there was a little green tree frog going cluck cluck in the background. The one that we didn't hear yet, the one that's found in Kankakee County, which is where this recording was made, is called Fowler's toad, and it kind of sounds like an angry sheep. So I have a recording of, I think this is the one that's just Fowler's toad, and people say it sounds like an angry sheep. In Illinois, though, they're only found along the Kankakee River, so that's why we didn't include that one. But you can hear it on this recording. So here's that same recording again of all 4 of these. Now, knowing what they are, see if you can pick them out. All right, here's another multi-species chorus. See if you can tell which species. I hear peepers. I hear gray tree frogs. And that's all that's present on this particular recordings. All right, it's another multi-species chorus. There's some insects on this recording, so this is a late season, probably late June or July. So you could hear that. The main one that you could hear there was the eastern gray tree frog, but there was also a green frog chucking in the background a little bit, and very faintly in the background were peepers and one toad. All right, another multi-species chorus. Another late season recording with insects on it as well. Most of the high-pitched noise that you hear on this recording is insects. And that's a green frog. Here's our bullfrog. So very late season, not much activity from the frogs. Probably this recording was from late July. Which one had the meow or the snore as their call? That's the one we hear here. And in the background there are peepers. So that was a pickerel frog and peepers. All right, so let's take a quiz. So you can use your notes for this quiz. I'm going to play some calls and you're going to tell me which frog is calling and give me a number for the level for that call. And then there's a few questions as well that you can answer. All right, here's the first one. Tell me which frog and the level, 1, 2, or 3. And tell me what the louder one is, because there's another one another species that's faintly calling in the background. Not that one, the one that's louder. That one. All right, second one. All right, third one. Not that level, this level. What species and what level? All right, so that is the end of our frog calls lab. So complete that and turn it in.